Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the unique show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. As Kurdish groups advance on ISIS-held territory around Raqqa, the Islamic State hits back with an attack on the border town of Kobani. The town was the scene of a brutal street-to-street battle where ISIS militants were dislodged after 4 months of fighting by Kurdish groups. But after losing control of the town 5 months ago, after hundreds of US-led airstrikes, the new attack has killed as many as 12, with activists reporting fierce clashes in the town centre. This comes as the Kurdish YPG captured towns just 30 miles from ISIS capital, Raqqa, and urged Syrian rebels to lead the push on the Islamic State capital. Today we discuss how US policy may change in light of Kurdish victories and what comes next in the war on ISIS. Joining us from our studio is Roshan Mohammed Saleh, a journalist and documentary maker. From Kurdistan, we have Hana Maroof, a journalist and master's student in politics and international relations, and Kevok Hayopajan, an international lawyer and fellow at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, joining us from Beirut. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the latest in the war on ISIS and the recent Kurdish advances.
As the Syria conflict continues to rage uncontrollably, Kurdish groups have registered a series of victories against ISIS militants. The Kurdish capture of a Syrian military base and nearby territory held by ISIS in recent days has put in renewed focus on the expanding ground fight against the terror network. Whilst it has been known that Kurdish groups such as the YPG can defend their territory particularly well, the capture of ISIS-held airbase is a positive sign that they can move forward. The jihadist group has suffered a series of defeats to Kurdish forces since being forced to withdraw from the town of Kobani in January. The Obama administration on Tuesday touted Kurdish-led advances against the Islamic State in Syria as a model for the US-backed effort to retake territory from the jihadist group. But US officials cautioned that the insurgents remained resilient and could strike back. It was also a stark reminder of Washington's stumbling bid to turn moderate Syrian Arab rebels into a viable fighting force, as well as a pointed message to the Iraqi government, which is struggling to rebuild its fragile military. In response to Islamic State fighters have attacked the Syrian city of Kobani months after being driven out in a symbolic battle that made international headlines. 2 car bombs and clashes with Kurdish defenders left up to 30 people dead and scores injured. IS shot dead 20 others in a village nearby, activists said. The terror group also seized parts of the key northeastern city of Hasakeh. Hasakeh is the largest city in northeastern Syria. An estimated 500,000 people live there, in addition to the thousands who have fled violence elsewhere.
Roshan, if we could start with you. If there is a model to fight ISIS, then surely the Kurdish groups have been the most effective.
Well, the US hasn't been effective, that's for sure. I think their attempts to bomb ISIS it's propaganda, it's PR, it's not very effective. They don't seem to be able to... I personally, I don't think it's about destroying ISIS. I think it's about delineating borders in which ISIS can operate. The only people that seem to have actually, as you say, have made progress on the ground against ISIS are the Kurdish forces.
Do you see the US becoming more supportive for Kurdish efforts?
I didn't hear the question, Daddy. Can you repeat it?
Do you see the US becoming more supportive for Kurdish efforts?
Well, I covered the Iraq war and occupation a few years back, and I remember visiting Iraqi Kurdistan. That was obviously a US protectorate in a way. They're really aiding Iraqi Kurdistan to become a de facto separate part of Iraq. And I think the similar thing might be happening in Syria. I know the dynamics aren't exactly the same between Iraq and Syria when it comes to the Kurds, but I think the US may see a de facto autonomous Syrian Kurdish entity in Syria as their way to a certain extent into Syria.
What could that mean for the Arab world in general, having an autonomous, complete Kurdish region which is in partnership fighting ISIS?
Danny, again, I didn't hear your question completely.
What could that mean for the Arab world to have a Kurdish autonomous region which is in partnership with the Arab world fighting ISIS?
Well, partnership of the Arab world, I don't think any of these partnerships remain constant for too long. I think we're just seeing a fragmentation of the Arab world completely. And the Syrian battlefield is an example of that, where you have myriad groups, sometimes allied with each other, sometimes fighting each other. I don't see Kurdish autonomy or independence happening anytime soon. But I think we are seeing a general fragmentation of the Arab world with no long-lasting alliances.
Okay, if we could take this to Hana al-Ma'rouf here, joining us. What's the view from Kurdistan? Is the US providing enough support for Kurdish groups in Iraq?
Yes, the United States have been working on helping the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan, and we should not forget their help, their immediate help when ISIS became a threat in August 2014 and were close to Erbil, the capital city of Iraq. Their immediate help and action was a big plus for Kurds, because they showed their loyalty to the Kurds and they showed their unity and their support to Kurdistan. Also, the airstrikes, which was every single day attacking ISIS territories and sending military advisors to help the Peshmerga. I think United States has been working to support the Kurds, because, as you know, the Kurds are mainly the only forces who are fighting truly ISIS.
Has the United States provided the Kurds in Syria with any realistic help?
The U.S. is trying to help Kurds in Syria, but we should not forget two facts. First, helping Kurds will give hope to them to have their own de facto place and territory, which may create some problems with Turkey. As you know, Turkey and the U.S., they're having alliances and they are cooperating together. So giving the power to Kurds in Syria might change the perspective of U.S. policy. That's why we don't see a lot of support from the United States to the Kurds in Syria. But in January, with the threat of what happened and with the attacks on Kobani, we saw U.S. support. We saw their airstrikes attacking ISIS, and also we saw Peshmerga, Kurdistan's Iraq's Peshmerga. They helped with YPG and supported them. So we see their support, but it's not the way we see it with Iraqi Kurdistan.
Now, how important is the ISIS attack on Kobani? Are we set for another prolonged struggle?
Sorry, I did not hear your question.
How important is the attack on Kobani by ISIS? Are we set for another huge battle?
I think the attack of ISIS in Kobani, it shows the strength of Kurds, because we see them targeting Kurds a lot. We see them changing their tactics and changing their strategies with their attacks, because they see Kurds as a powerful enemy for them. So that's why they're changing the way they're attacking Kurds. And we recently saw that in 2 days in Kobani and what they did. So also in the last week with Tel Abyad and how Kurds thrive was being shown there, and their big lose, I said, we see how they're revenging and how they're trying to attack the Kurds again. So that's why this is a proof for the world that the Kurds are a major target for ISIS for now, and it shows the strength of Kurds for not resigning and keeping their battle.
Okay, if we could take this to Kevork now. There are Kurdish areas in Aleppo as well, such as Sheikh Maqsood in the northern district. Have they been attacked by ISIS?
Good evening, Danny. First of all, let's say Ramadan Kareem to the Muslim world, and let me offer my deep condolences to the relatives of the victims of today's attacks in Paris, Kuwait, and Tunisia. With regards to the Kurdish areas or Kurdish populated areas in Aleppo, actually it's divided between two areas which is under the control of the opposition, and areas which are under control of the Syrian government, and like most of the areas where it's under the control of the Syrian government, there are attacks committed not only by ISIS but other opposition groups as well.
Now, how much of Aleppo does ISIS control?
Actually, ISIS is far away from the center of Aleppo. However, the threat of being attacked by ISIS is still high because ISIS is adopting the policy of attacking somewhere else when they are losing ground somewhere in their battle. So the risk is still very high. But now, I mean, for today, ISIS is not in Aleppo, but in the surroundings of Aleppo.
Now, what can you tell us about the fate of the Armenian community in northern Syria?
Well, Danny, the fate of the Armenian community is not different from the fate of most of the Alepponers who live in Aleppo. However, they have many difficulties in terms of services, in terms of security, economic difficulties, and to be honest with you, the number of the Armenians has been decreasing, especially after the end of the academic year. We are witnessing a flow of new immigrants from Aleppo, Armenians of Aleppo towards Lebanon and Armenia. So the fate of the Armenians in Aleppo is not bright because they can't see a light at the end of the tunnel till this moment. But there are plenty of them who see in Aleppo, and they believe that Aleppo or Syria is not a hotel for them when they don't like the services, they left the country and go. They are the citizens of the country, and they have equal duties and rights as the rest of the Syrian people.
Could you give us a brief percentage on how many have left?
Well, according to official report made by the prelates of the Armenian church in Aleppo, almost 40 to 50% of the Armenians of Aleppo have already left the city.
Wow. Roshan, if we could take this back to you, Western nations have argued that ISIS is a creation of President Assad. How fair is this assessment?
I think it's a conspiracy theory, Danny. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I mean, some people will say that the US is allied with Iran in Iraq, for example, and they concocted the whole thing, the whole invasion. But, you know, conspiracy theories are to a penny in the Arab world, aren't they? Not just the Arab world, all over the world. I think that it's obvious that ISIS and Assad have been fighting battles recently, in Palmyra recently and other places. In northern Syria, so they have come into conflict. I think there's a case to say that in the early years of the uprising, the insurrection, Assad may have left ISIS alone to a certain extent because he saw that ISIS was fighting other rebel groups and he was content for them to attack each other. But to say that ISIS is a concoction of the Syrian intelligence agency, I think is very far-fetched.
So could it be kind of this concept of my enemy's enemy is my friend type theory, or not that far perhaps?
Look, geopolitics is complicated, alliances change all the time, everyone's looking out for their own interests, and sometimes your enemy's enemy does become your friend. But the accusation goes much further than that. I attended the Geneva II conference in Geneva last year on the Syrian conflict, and the Syrian opposition was blatantly saying, and this was repeated time and time again by the Western media, that Assad created ISIS again and again and again. And, you know, the more you, say something which could be a lie, I suppose the more people will believe it. But I don't see any evidence for it.
Now, is the Islamic State a manifestation of the broader problem that inflicts Western nations in terms of jihadists and radicalization?
Well, first of all, I think that ISIS is a threat to the Middle East. I don't see it as much of a threat to the West at the moment. That's what's making all the headlines in America and Britain, the so-called terrorist threat to the Western countries.
But an example today, perhaps, the events in Lyon, the tragic beheading
I'm not saying
of
that ISIS poses no threat to the West. But what I'm saying is that it's quite a limited, controllable threat. And maybe that's how the West intelligence agencies like it, because they can get lots of money to bolster their security budgets. They have this enemy to confront, but at the same time, it's a threat which is not existential. Whereas ISIS potentially could be, or jihadism, radical jihadism, could potentially be an existential threat to the Middle East.
Is there a coherent way of stopping homegrown terrorism?
In the West, you mean?
Yeah.
It's very complicated because the factors behind homegrown terrorism, as you put it, are myriad. It could be a little bit of foreign policy, it could be a little bit of kind of Salafi jihadi ideology, it could be due to alienation, Islamophobia, racism. There's lots of things that go into the mix. So I think that in terms of fighting homegrown jihadism, I think the governments really need to work with Muslim communities, listen to what they have to say, to take that forward. But I think ultimately Western nations also need to change their destructive foreign policies in the Middle East. And I also think that the kind of Salafi Wahhabi ideology, I don't want to get sectarian here, but it has been really taking over British Islam over the last 30 years now, the same in America. And I think that internally the Muslim community needs to dissociate itself from that kind of ideology promoted by Saudi Arabia.
So would you argue that Salafism or Wahhabism has weaponized political Islam in the West?
Look, I don't want to condemn Salafis because they are not a homogenous group. But there is an element of Salafism, Salafi jihadism, extreme Wahhabism, which I consider to be hijacking the house of Islam at the moment and tarnishing Islam in the eyes of the world. And we're seeing extreme manifestations of that ripping apart the Middle East. But I also think there's a lot of Western complicity here, because I think they've been in bed with the Salafi jihadis for many years. They use them to confront their enemies, and then they destroy them when they get too much of a problem and there's blowback in Western countries. So a lot of things going on here, Danny. It's not easy to kind of put the finger on one problem and say that's how you solve it.
Okay, we'll get back to you on this. Hanar Ma'ruf, from joining us from Kurdistan. How do you see the war on ISIS panning out now?
I see ISIS as losing territories, and as you mentioned it now, what happened today in France and what happened in Kuwait, and all these countries that are getting affected and threatened by ISIS. So that will be a big plus as well for Kurds, because these countries will send more aid and will support these people who are, and these forces who are fighting ISIS. So I think ISIS, as it is one of the biggest threats for the world, having these attacks, it will help the Kurds, and it will help all these people who are fighting against them in order to demolish them. So I don't think they will last long, and they're losing so much territories as we see them in Kurdistan and also in Syria. So they won't last long, hopefully.
Also, a quick mention for the events in Tunisia, which took the lives of around 30 innocent individuals. But back to Iraq and Syria now. Have Kurdish groups now set an overall example as to how to fight this terrorist group? Kurds
set up a great example, because they have been showing their strength, and they have been showing their beliefs and their ideology of not giving up, while having less weapons, and they're sacrificing with their lives and with having less weapons comparing to what ISIS have. Also, not forgetting the female fighters who are globally allying other females, and they're inspiring so many women to come and join them. So as you know, it's a war against extremist group, but also it's a war to prove Kurds' survival, and also proving our bravery and establishing cantons in our own places, and also proving the ability that Kurds have to fight such a big enemy.
This has also led to tension in some areas and locations with native Arabs How do you see this going out? I mean, is there real tension between Kurdish groups and Arabic, probably Syrian rebel groups or original Iraqi groups? How bad is the tension in some areas?
I don't think there's a lot of tensions between Kurds and Arabs, because recently we just saw in Tel Aviv when Kurds succeeded there and they could take away ISIS. We saw so many forces who are loyal to the previous Damascus regime. They joined YPG. And also we see that here in the Kurdish part of Iraq, we see them fighting and trying to liberate Mosul and to join the Arab forces as well to help them. So I don't see a big conflict between Arabs and Kurds when it comes to ISIS, because, as you know, they need our help, and Kurds, they are really fighting with their lives and with less weapons that they have. So I think if Arabs try to make tensions, that won't be for their benefit.
Okay, last question to you. Has Turkey had a negative role in the war on ISIS? The latest elections and the Kurds tribe HDP, I think it led Turkey to, unfortunately, involve in this war more and to support ISIS more. 25% of Turkey are Kurds, and Erdogan fears the raise of their voice. That's why, ponder the ramifications of what I just said. They're trying to help ISIS, and as they see them as a lesser evil than Kurds, and we saw their help in letting ISIS to attack Kobani from their borders, and these are all negative facts for Turkey, because I think diplomatically they will lose, and that's globally now people are talking about what Turkey had just done. So I think that will be a lose for them. Hana Maroof, a journalist and master student in politics and international relations, joined us from Kurdistan. Thank you very much. If we could take this to Roshan, how do you see the role of Turkey, peacemaker or agitator?
Well, I think it's obvious. It's interesting listening to Hana there. I think Turkey has facilitated ISIS. I mean, the Saudis and the Qataris have been funding them, and the Turks have been letting them across the border to wreak havoc in northern Syria. And I think it's almost unforgivable. I mean, I used to be a kind of fan of Erdogan a few years back, and I thought his kind of zero problems policy with his neighbors was great. But over the last few years, I've really kind of disappointed by his actions, because they basically destabilized a foreign country. I mean, I must say that I'm not, I've never been a fan of Bashar al-Assad. I don't speak for him, but ultimately, Syria was a stable country. And the problems were internal problems. But as soon as you internationalize those problems, you make them a million times worse, and the situation spirals out of control, and more people start dying. And we've got 250,000 people dead in Syria. Everyone in the West seems to blame it on Bashar al-Assad. But if you look at the breakdown of the numbers killed, it's fairly even in terms of government troops and loyalists killed, and rebel troops and loyalists
In fact,
killed.
I think government troops are actually more than rebels killed.
Yeah. So it's a
Statistically
two-sided war here. It's a multi-sided war. It's not the good versus evil David and Goliath battle that is being projected in the West. And as far as Turkey's role, look, let's call a spade a spade. They have let hundreds, thousands of terrorists cross their border. They have control of that border. ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, all these other guys, they would not be operating in the efficacious way that they are operating if it wasn't for Turkey.
Okay. Kevork, as the Syria war continues for the fourth continuous year, where does this leave minorities in the country?
Well, it's very difficult and complicated question, the fate of the minorities in Syria, because in fact minorities are vulnerable people and they need support in peaceful times. So what they need in war times is more important and more fundamental in order to secure their right of existence, their right to preserve their identity, their right to enjoy their right to preserve their traditions, languages, etc. The minorities in Syria nowadays, besides being targeted by the opposition, most of the minorities are targeted by the opposition, like the Christians, recently the Druze. We have seen what happened in Idlib a few weeks ago, the Alawites, the Shiites, most of them are targeted by the so-called ISIS or other.
I mean, the prime example would be the execution of around 20 Druze villages in Idlib by al-Nusra Front. This has had probably a vast international consequences with many different media outlets, worldwide officials discussing this, with even Israel being touted as a potential savior of the Druze, much to the surprise of many. But has the world, in essence, done enough to protect these types of minorities in Syria, as they have in Iraq, for instance?
I don't think so. The international community has failed to protect the minorities in Syria because they failed not only to solve the Syrian crisis, but they had their direct and indirect role to escalate the crisis and not to lead to its solution or to the peaceful end.
Okay, final question to you. Do you see any chance of a negotiated settlement in Aleppo?
Well, I believe that the negotiation is the most successful way to establish a sustainable peace. However, to have a fruitful negotiations, you have to have the ground, the social society, the civil movement, the peaceful youth. You have to give the power to the youth and community leaders in order to have their role to establish that negotiation. I mean, we have to go from down to top and not from the top to the down, from the community level and not from the leadership.
Okay. Kevok Hayopajan, international lawyer and fellow at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, joined us from Beirut. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Welcome.
Please stay with us as we enter the next section. With the Syria war entering possibly its most deadly phase, the diplomatic momentum to push forward a solution seems to have been stopped in its tracks. A Russian initiative to find a consensus between the government and the opposition has failed, whilst the UN plan to freeze fighting in Aleppo has also been unsuccessful. Staffan de Mistura was recently in Damascus. On his visit, Aleppo was bombarded with mortar attacks, which he described as an indiscriminate attack on civilians, also adding that the government should not retaliate by dropping barrel bombs on populated areas in the divided historic city. We discuss how it is possible for someone or some state of sorts to create a solution in Syria. We are joined by Giovanni Rossini, a freelance journalist and blogger. Giovanni, thanks for joining us. Syria has been in a civil conflict for over 4 years. How can the violence be stopped?
I think the violence could not be stopped in those months. That's because I think that the war is not going to an end. Bashar al-Assad is in difficult. We saw that. He has the help of Hezbollah, for example, in a lot of areas of Syria, like the coast areas and the Kalamon area. But is not so weak to be defeated by the rebel forces, jihadi forces, and the Free Syrian Army. And these forces are not so strong, I think, and solid to win against Bashar al-Assad. And I think there is another important question. Does the international community want really that rebel forces win this war? I don't think so. So I think this will be a long war,
Is fighting ISIS now more important to the Western nations than fighting Assad, for example?
Okay, in my opinion, I think that fight against ISIS in this moment is more important than to fight against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, because I think that at the end of this war, Bashar al-Assad will be defeated. Also, if jihadi groups and rebel groups will be defeated too. And but I think that in this moment they represent a stronger menace and a more concrete menace for the Syrian population and for the population of the rest of the world. But I don't know if international community and Occidental countries think has my same idea, and I think if they think so, they should work for a stronger military campaign, because we saw after 4 years of war that this approach to the war is not enough to defeat ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all the other rebel forces in the country quickly. I think that there are three possibilities. Assad could be defeated, but the risk is to create another Libya, and it could be a very bad thing. The second one is that Occidental countries could could defeat the rebel forces, and after that wait for the end of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And the third one, and I think this is the most probable, is that they in the next future they will decide to maintain the status quo and wait for a change that can help them to take a decision.
Okay, Roshan, if I could take this to you, what would it take to find a solution in Syria?
How to find a solution?
Sorry, the question to Roshan in our studio, what would it take to find a solution?
I think it's going to take a stalemate on the battlefield. I think it's going to take a realization on both sides that they can't win. At the moment, I think the rebel coalition feel as though they have the wind in their sails, and I think they're gearing up for a major assault on Aleppo this year, and they feel as though they can be in Damascus next year, perhaps. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that, Assad still has the support still has a cohesive army, more or less, still has the support of Russia and Iran, still has that air superiority, but the rebels have massive things going for them as well, such as the support of major regional superpowers like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent Qatar. So I think that ultimately, it's going to take both sides realizing that going on is pointless, and both sides realizing that they can't win a complete victory, and ultimately, and it's going to take regional pressure as well and international pressure, because obviously Syrians aren't in control of their own destiny here. They're kind of pawns in the hands of regional and international powers, and it's going to take that regional environment to force a solution.
Given all the political and diplomatic maneuvering in Iraq, what role does Tehran have to play in Syria and in the conflict?
Well, look, I think Iran really needs to step up its game here, because Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey have shown a volition over the last 3 months to win this war. Now, if they do win this war, it's going to be a disaster. It'll be Libya times 1 million. It will be chaos and it will be anarchy, and it will spread to regional countries. At the moment, it's terrible. The loss of life is terrible, but it's limited to Syria. If Assad falls, it will spread to Lebanon. It will spread to Jordan. It will spread to Turkey. Eventually, it will spread to Iran. It will consume the entire region. Iran realizes that. I am convinced they realize that. And I am convinced they're going to do everything they possibly can to ensure that Assad doesn't fall in the short term, and in the long term, a Tehran-friendly regime remains.
Okay. Giovanni, if I could ask you, Are there many Italians who have joined ISIS?
Not so many Italians. That's because Italy, I think, has a very good organization for the counter-terrorism. In fact, we in our country we talk about just 2 cases, I think, that people that try to go to Syria or Iraq to fight with ISIS, but they failed. And our ministry, in Ministry of Inter, talks about 45 people that could be dangerous that are under control of our intelligence. So our number very low if we compare with I don't know, United Kingdom or France or other European countries. So Italy is in a good position, we can say.
Okay, thank you very much. Giovanni Rossini, a journalist, a freelance journalist, joined us from Italy. Roshan, if I could just ask you, some have doubted the ability of the rebels to actually unite and form a coherent army structure. Have they started to prove people wrong?
It does seem as though that's the case to a certain extent. It seems as though the rebels are now divided into 2 camps, and ISIS and everyone else. So you have the Free Syrian Army, supposedly moderate, fighting with Al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and all these other groups, myriad other groups. Then you have the Southern Front as well. So they do seem to have, it's all being instigated, isn't it, by Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, who themselves have put their differences aside.
But also the US to an extent, because the US now seeks to train even more rebel fighters. So does Syria have the potentiality to be Afghanistan number 2?
In terms of America backing the so-called
militants
Mujahideen,
who in turn take over the country, and then it creates kind of a false flag situation in essence.
I think where I disagree with a lot of newspaper columnists and media commentators about Western strategy in Syria, they all say it's failing. I think it's working, because I think their strategy is a chaos. They don't particularly want either side to win. I think at the beginning they were they wanted Bashar al-Assad to fall quickly, but now they've seen what the opposition holds, and they think that might be as bad or worse from their point of view. So I think ultimately their strategy is to bog Middle Eastern nations down in a fight, so that neither one of them becomes too powerful. They pursue a kind of balance of power strategy in the Middle East. They're very happy to see Iran bogged down in Syria. They're probably reasonably happy to see Saudi Arabia as well, and other nations, and Turkey bogged down, because they don't want any one overall hegemon to appear. So I think their strategy is chaos, and it's working. So they're backing one side at the moment, but maybe, who knows, and this might be a controversial point, but maybe if it looks as though Assad is about to fall, they might even send some covert help to ensure that he doesn't fall. Because I think they're very happy with all these myriad groups weakening each other. As long as they're fighting amongst themselves, they're not fighting Israel, and they're not trying to kick the West out of the Middle East.
Depending on the balance of powers, of course. Okay, so for more perspective on this issue, Ala Ibrahim, Syrian war correspondent and journalist, joins us from Damascus. Hi Ala, thank you for joining us. What's the view from Damascus? Is there any reliance on a political solution as we speak?
Well, it doesn't seem at this point that there is any credible political solution for the Syrian conflict, including the Russian plan that's aimed at putting together a lot of factions of the Syrian opposition. That plan was thwarted by the refusal of many opposition bodies, including the Syrian National Coalition of Opposition Powers, one of the main Western-backed opposition bodies. Its refusal to take part in Moscow meetings to reach an accord or an agreement for Syrian opposition groups, that this agreement could be used to start some negotiations with the Syrian government. So I think at this point, political solution is a bit out of the question.
Has the government in Syria been helping Kurdish groups to defend themselves?
Could you repeat that? I didn't get that.
Has the government in Damascus been helping Kurdish groups to defend themselves?
Well, the Syrian government has been very silent in its relations with the Kurdish militias and the Kurdish fighters. My sources are telling me that there has been some level of coordination between the Syrian government and the Kurdish militias. The Kurdish militias, I can assure this, receive weapons and ammunition from the Syrian government. But after the U.S. escalation started against Aleppo, it seems that the Kurdish militias have chosen to rely more on the help of the U.S. coalition. And as a result, their ties with the Syrian government are not as strong as they used to be. We have to bear in mind that rebel factions, such as the FSA, small factions of the FSA, are actually taking part in the fighting with the Kurdish militias in several areas alongside the Kurdish militias, in several areas in Syria.
How do you see, Ala, how do you see the Syria crisis panning out now?
Again, you have to repeat the question.
How do you see the Syria crisis panning out now?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, and I don't think at this point we can have a logic or something to term in nothing. But I can tell you one thing: the situation is very complicated and very difficult.
Thank you very much. Ala Ibrahim, a Syrian war correspondent and journalist, joined us from Damascus. Roshan, last question to you. How do you see the Syria war progressing now? Briefly.
I think it's going to result in the demarcation of Syria. I think it's going to break up. I think Assad will retain control of the coastal areas, Damascus, the major cities. I think the north will go to a Turkish control zone, and parts of Syria will be in utter chaos.
Okay, that's all we have time for. A big thank you to all of my guests today. We leave you with a piece of Syria's history, present and future.
The war in Syria has left little space for sentiment or the admiration of the country's magnificent history. Yet despite the efforts of war and its devastation, areas of such an historic importance remain firmly in the hearts and minds of Syrians and the international organizations who work tirelessly to help protect them. None of the many heritage sites are more important than the monumental citadel of Aleppo, rising above the souks, mosques and madrasas of the old walled city, as testament to Arab military might from the 12th to the 14th centuries. The old city of Aleppo reflects the rich and diverse cultures of its successive occupants. Many periods of history have left their influence in the architectural fabric of the city. Remains of Hittite, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, and Ayyubid structures and elements are incorporated in the massive surviving citadel. Aleppo is Syria's second largest city, and the citadel has been damaged by 4 years of relentless war. UNESCO has also warned of its destruction and the fate of Aleppo, arguing that it stands ready to provide all of its expertise and support for the safeguarding of Aleppo and of all Syria's extraordinary cultural heritage. As the conflict increases in brutality, we remember that Aleppo remains a standing pearl of the Syria and the Middle East.
Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Until next time.